I'm Nathan Gita.
And I'm Aaron Ekman.
From BC's northern capital.
Welcome to the Ram and Stag Show.
Well, it's Ram and Stag, and we're here to comment on this latest announcement from Premier David Eby, as well as a whole treasure trove of NDP ministers, cabinet, staff, who knows who else is at this thing. They won't pan the other way, so we can start profiling who's there. But in any case, they are talking about affordable housing in British Columbia. A hot topic, always a hot topic. The solution? Let people live their best lives. That's what the rent liaison guy said. And the premier followed up with there will be $500 million, $500 million put towards nonprofits purchasing houses.
Well, there's a whole industry of sort of nonprofit housing agencies down in Vancouver. And you've probably read about a number of them in the headlines over the last few years because some of their executive directors, for instance, have been found to have been skimming funds, and it's a fairly.
I thought that was the nature of an executive director.
Yeah, you thought that was in the job description.
I thought that was in there somewhere.
Yeah. So these kind of agencies have been around for years and years and years. The housing problem in Vancouver has not been fixed. It's why we've said in previous episodes the perennial promise of every mayoral candidate in Vancouver is to fix or solve housing. None of them have done it. All of them have made it worse. Most of them have been from the progressive side of the aisle. And now we've got a premier who's also the former housing minister who's just announced that he's going to throw more money at the same organizations that are essentially market-based. I mean, progressives like to fool themselves into thinking that because these are non-profit agencies, that they don't make any profit, or that they don't pay their executive director six figures a year, or they don't have a rather large board made up of all sorts of people that aren't really progressive.
Old and new money, yeah. Yes.
Like there's a lot of money being made here, and a lot of the source capital tends to come in from government. So, but what's interesting to me is David Eby, he wore a number of hats. But it's not like he was an inactive housing minister. He got in that big fight with Penticton City Council we've talked to before and basically imposed an entire operation on top of them against their wishes. So why didn't he make this announcement while he was housing minister before he became premier? Was it something that John Horgan was not in favor of? Was it something he couldn't get through cabinet?
I think it's just big and shiny, so it makes it look like he's the new white horse, he's the new savior. Because that was always the thing about Horgan seemed folksy, but to a certain element on the progressive side, especially those who felt betrayed about what happened to the peace and other things, he had become the dark horse. And for that matter, for a lot of people, they said he was indistinguishable from Doug Ford. So it just happened to be on an orange party instead of a blue party. But now I think Eby gets to come in and be like, no, look at me. I'm the new. I'm the fresh. I'm the young. I have new ideas. Let's get rolling. Look at how cool I am.
Well, that's great. He's all of those things, but he doesn't have a mandate. Right? That's the problem. So that's why the question of why he didn't announce this as Minister of Housing under a John Horgan premiership is an important question, because if it is in fact a huge demarcation from sort of the Horgan policy or approach to housing, then where is your mandate for this? Nobody has voted for this. I mean, say what you will about Danielle Smith in Alberta, at least she can demonstrate majority support from her own party, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and the Alberta...
There was a competition. There were not just disqualified candidates and then
and it was a rather robust competition.
Yeah, no, people had some things to say.
Well, there were heavyweight candidates within that milieu who had been leader in the past of predecessor parties, et cetera. It wasn't just a show, right? Mm-hmm. And so she can demonstrate that. She can, I recall not so long ago, and this is what makes this stuff so funny if you actually watch the iterations of the NDP across jurisdictions.
Yeah, or so you don't have amnesia. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. the Alberta NDP spent a lot of time screaming for Danielle Smith to call a by-election when she didn't hold a seat. So, she did, and she won it handedly. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of stopped hearing them call for a general election, which they did initially. They were saying, well, call a snap election. The reason they've stopped calling for that now is probably twofold. Number one, it kind of harms the credibility of their BC counterpart, who happens to be premier, with no mandate either from the electorate or his party. Mm-hmm. But also, if you look at a poll in Alberta, it shows that the UCP under Danielle Smith pose a 60% chance of winning a majority of seats if an election was called today. So you don't see them calling for that for those two reasons. But if Eby wants to deliver on this new list of things that he has introduced to British Columbia as the new premier, it's a good idea to have a mandate for those things. He's said, I think, when pressed by reporters, that he has no intention of calling an early election. And it's quite possible that the opposition, from my perspective, having a leader who is probably unelectable in this context, and there being a burgeoning other party in on that side of the political spectrum that could do quite well in the interior, for instance, he probably would do well to call an election right now. None of that really affects the point that he needs a mandate if he wants to do things that are new and a significant departure from the elected mandate that preceded him. He doesn't have that. So the more bold he intends to be, the more this question is going to dog him. Where's your mandate for this? How is this anything but fundamentally undemocratic?
I think this might be a really big reason why there could be a snap election. At the same time, I wonder if the voters care about that anymore. Like, honestly, like we understand that, right? People who study this stuff, who read it, who watch it, right, who tweet about it, they're all deep into it. But do voters care about this question of mandate or even legitimacy around that, or do they care more about results? I think this is a serious question for us as we really turn the corner into the 21st century here. We are now long past the last millennium. We are long past the land of the 90s, and those are becoming faint memories. There are people, there are children, no longer children, now young adults, alive today who can vote now, who have no recollection whatsoever of that time and the way things were done then. And so that doesn't mean that everything has changed and there's no legitimacy to it. But at the same time, maybe the premier will just keep on cruising until the expected date of the next election, because why not? If the average voter is just like, well, I just want to see good results, and they don't really care whether or not it was Horgan or Eby who put it together, or for that matter, Christy Clark, like, to them, especially considering that the parties have basically merged on all these issues, it doesn't really matter who's in charge.
No, it's a very valid question to raise, and it's pretty clear to me that it's precisely on that question that Eby is banking. So I think he assumes that British Columbians, at least a majority of voters, mostly centered around the Lower Mainland, vote-rich Lower Mainland ridings, are going to be fine with what he's doing because they don't like the BC Liberals. So I think he's banking. And look, it was demonstrated even within the echelons of the New Democratic Party in BC that a majority of people didn't care how he was elevated to the premiership. Mm-hmm. A majority of people, I don't see a big revolt in the BC NDP over what happened to his only challenger. I don't see a huge revolt.
Well, for that matter, at this very meeting, right? We've still got, just below the camera here, we've just got the screen up still of this latest stream, and there's Ravi Kahlon. He was seen as definitively a serious contender for the premiership, for the leadership of the party, right after Horgan announced that he was going to step down, and he disappeared without so much as a thought. No one saw it coming, and then no one saw him leave because he wasn't there. He just disappeared, and he didn't put his name in.
Yeah, Ravi. I mean, his disappearance wasn't as surprising to me as the disappearance of others. Partially because Ravi's amongst the youngest in caucus, got lots of time. Probably looked at the tea leaves at the time and thought, well, it's a bit dicey on whether we can actually get reelected for another term after the state of the province, effectively. And a lot of animosity, I think, that a lot of people direct towards the NDP over their handling of COVID. Ironically, a lot of that animosity coming from the pro-lockdown side. Their biggest beef in the Lower Mainland, sort of the public sector circle, with the NDP is they didn't lock down hard enough, right? So, it might have been a calculated decision he made. Probably looked at support base. Eby does have a rather insulated support base within the NDP milieu. Related to the university, et cetera, and some in the Green Movement, et cetera, although I think he's burned a lot of that support in the amongst the general electorate in terms of how he handled the leadership race. I was more surprised by the departure of people like Farnworth, Selena Robinson, Nathan Cullen. You could maybe even throw George Heyman in there. That was more surprising because, that was a group of people that saw themselves, I think, as more in line for the position. So they all might have had a number of different reasons why they pulled out. But I think, again, on this particular announcement, what's important as a takeaway is that we do have a premier in office that has not demonstrated majority support of the electorate outside of his own riding. He cannot demonstrate majority support. It's not that he doesn't have majority support in his party, but he can't demonstrate that he does because he's never been tested. And he's embarking on what he wants, I think, British Columbians to perceive as a bold new direction for British Columbia. He's making all sorts of big housing announcements just to get started. And he released a few days ago this big list, this big action plan he's going to embark on. But he's doing so without a mandate. And so it really is going to dog him each time he makes these announcements. Like, where do you get the mandate for that? You need a I mean, if you flash back momentarily just to 2020, when the NDP did call an early election, what was their stated rationale? We know what the real rationale was. They were looking at the polls, and they also looked at how bad things were going to get, fiscally speaking, in terms of the projections, and they thought, well, our best chance of winning is calling the election now. But that wasn't
especially with it being 2020, because, of course, everybody's looking south to the States.
But that wasn't their stated justification for calling the election then. If you recall, the stated justification from the Premier's mouth was things are going to change. We didn't anticipate the effects of this pandemic. We're going to have to make decisions that we did not introduce during the last election campaign. We need a new mandate for that. So Horgan called an election 2 years before he was required to. Why? Well, he told us it was because he felt he no longer had the mandate upon which he'd been elected because the whole game had changed.
That was quite quaint at the time,
wasn't it? And so why in this circumstance do we have a premier with no mandate from even his party now embarking on this bold new action plan when they've called snap elections for far less in the past?
And
he could win. I mean, he could win.
He could win.
What's he worried about?
So something that occurs to me is let's say that he actually doubles down. So instead of calling a snap election, this is very inside pool, but let's just theorize here for a second. Instead of calling a snap election, he actually makes it a confidence motion within his cabinet and of course within the legislature, which of course the opposition will be able to vote on. But he'll make it a confidence motion as to whether or not some of these policies are going to be implemented. And so he does that, and what he's doing, of course, is daring the opposition to vote against him.
There isn't enough votes. It's not a minority.
Well, no, but he also is daring even those within his party, whether or not they're going to stand in solidarity or not.
But even at the end of that exercise, all he can do is demonstrate that he's got majority caucus support. Mm-hmm. But he's not, it's not a secret ballot, right? Now you take those same caucus members and you allow them to vote secretly in a leadership race, and he might not pull the same numbers.
That's true.
Right? So he cannot demonstrate that he's got party support. He cannot demonstrate that the grassroots, even of the New Democratic Party in British Columbia, support him. He can't demonstrate it. It's not that they don't, but he can't demonstrate it because he hasn't submitted himself to the same test that every other person that occupies that office submits themselves to. All he can do is demonstrate that the cabinet ministers that are subject to his whims support him in Parliament.
I believe there's a new record of cabinet ministers and parliamentary secretaries.
Generally the case whenever the BC NDP takes over.
There's just like basically the entire first three rows of their side of the bench is just it's just nonstop ministers and stuff.
When their first premier was elected, Dave Barrett, I mean, the first order of business was to increase the size of the premier's bureaucracy multiple times fold. And of course, we all recall one of the first things John Horgan did when Selina Robinson became premier was up his own premier's office budget by I think $4 million additional dollars per year. Like it's just they can't seem to run government without
how many
finding
data
jobs.
And comms monkeys does one need? I don't know.
I don't know if they have as many as Christy Clark had on staff because there was a point in time when Christy Clark employed more comms professionals, I understand, than every reporter at every major news outlet in the province combined. But there's no evidence that the NDP has shrunk that complement. I suspect it might be larger.
That would explain such a good quality of this video. Yeah, no, really, and the great staging
It's
they did
lit
for
well.
this. Yeah, it's really well lit. Of course, we're also not being shown the audience. They're not clapping very well, but I mean, they'll figure it out eventually, I'm sure.
It's hard to get the teleprompter claps.
They just haven't been paid in their new condos yet. Anyways, I think that about brings it to an end there. I think that he would be unwise to call a snap election. Not because I don't think he could win. I think he would win. I think that the BC Liberals are totally disorganized. I think that they've lost the confidence of a lot of the province.
Leader.
They've got a leader who, again, I can barely remember the name of. In fact, I remember it by remembering how chaotic our times are. The falcon could not hear the falconer. But nonetheless, I think that what will happen is he's just going to continue to roll coal and just do what he's going to do.
Of course he is.
And make his policies, because I think at the bottom line, you're not wrong. I think your objections are completely correct. But the problem is, people care about results, and if the results are, hey, look, I get a cheaper house, or I get a cheaper apartment or something, I don't think that's going to last, let's be clear. But on the one hand, they're getting a result, and on the other hand, his opposition is going to be like, man, he's handing out money like popcorn. No one's going to be able to beat him.
I agree with you in terms of the electorate in Vancouver and Victoria. I think in the interior, it's a different scenario. I think people, they see $500 million going to housing in British Columbia, and they know what that means. It means Vancouver. Mm-hmm. How much of that $500 million is going to end up in the interior, where people want to own houses, right?
$3 whole.
And so that's the problem people have with both parties, is that there's no, in the interior anyway, there's no confidence that either party, either leader from either party is going to govern in a way that suggests that they care about the whole province versus just governing for Vancouver and Victoria. That's the ongoing issue, I think, that is going to start to exacerbate the divisions between the tiny little corner of British Columbia where most people live and the rest of the province where most people feel unrepresented.
No, absolutely. Well, that's our take on this latest announcement from the EB government, or the EB government without a mandate, if you prefer. Tune in next time for more commentary about BC and all of its issues.